Hello and welcome to this Pixeltope tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you how to set up an AR scene. So the first thing I do is that I create an empty level. An empty level only contains the Pixeltope essential actors, as you can see in the outliner. I then go to World Settings and I scroll down until I see the AR panel and I press Enable AR. And if I go under the optimization tab and choose the fill, I can see what my camera is seeing. So in my scene I have placed a real box to use as a light reference, so I can see exactly how shadows, ambient occlusion and reflections is supposed to look. It's always good to have a good reference when you're doing AR lighting. I'm just minimizing this into down to the corner. And the what you see is what you get mode is enabled. That means that our output texture will update as I work. So I start by creating a plane, adding that to the scene and setting this to 0, 0, 0. This will act as our floor and as our shadow and reflection catcher. So you can see I'm basically just trying to roughly match the floor of the green screen. It's also good to save our level before we start doing some actual work. So I'm pressing File, Save As, and I'm giving this level a name, AR Tutorial. So since I've placed the real cube in the green screen studio, it's I'm using a digital cube as well to match the lighting. So our scene now is pitch black because it doesn't contain any lights. So in order to actually see something, I'm gonna add a skylight, setting this to movable, and I'm gonna use a specified cube map just so the light have some data that I can cast light from. I'm setting this to a very low value. So right now the box is penetrating the floor a little bit, so I'm moving this up so it's aligned with the floor. You can also use the different view modes in order to line it up. Going back into the perspective mode. And now I'm converting this floor mesh to a shadow and reflection catcher. So the shadow catcher doesn't really work yet because we need to set the light source to actually cast shadow on it in order for it to display correctly. So that's why you see it's black in the output window. So I'm just moving the box so it looks like it's standing next to the real box. Then I'm gonna add a light source. So I'm adding a spotlight. Just dragging that into the scene, placing setting it to movable first and adding it to 0, 0, 0. And then just roughly try to match the position of the real light that we have in the studio. So you can see there's one light down to the left and one to the right, and there's also two outside the camera view that you can't see in this image, but there are two similar lights in the ceiling. So I'm taking a copy of the spotlight, holding down Alt and drag will make a copy. And I'm also increasing the cone angle a little bit, just to get rid of the spotlight effect, because they're not really spotlights, the real eyes that we have. And then I'm just like really roughly just trying to match the position. It doesn't have to be exact. And then alt dragging, making 2 copies for the 2 lamps in the ceiling, and just tilting those downwards slightly. This box by default has a default material assigned to it, and this only has 100% white pure color, and that's not really a good starting point for doing lighting, because it will always look overexposed. So I'm just assigning the broad grid material instead. And I always like to try to match my digital scene as closely as I can to the real scene. So I'm creating a new material and calling this green screen. And then I double click that, and it opens the material editor. And in the base color, I assign a color, a parameter. And then I use the color picker tool to actually pick the color from the camera input. And then I add a parameter to the roughness channel, just so I can increase the roughness values a bit, so it doesn't look so glossy. So yeah, something like this. It doesn't have to be precise. It's just for when we view our scene. So I save this and I close down the material editor again, and I assign this to the floor. So you can see if I increase the intensity of this light, you can see that the shadows that the box is catching is actually penetrating the wall, because we need some kind of geometry to match our real set. So then I do alt drag and take a copy of the floor. Turn on snapping, so it's easier to rotate 90 degrees. And I do the same for the other wall. And again, this doesn't have to be 100% precise. It's only so that the shadows will be cast the way they should. So now you can see there's actually it looks like the shadows from the box is actually hitting the walls as well. So then I go and save my scene again. As you can see, the shadows now look a bit too harsh compared to our reference. So I'm going into preview live mode. Then I open director, and under production in the composite menu, you see I have an option called shadows onto backplate. I'm just going to clear out the values back to default. So you can this gives me the access to controlling the opacity of the shadows, and the same with ambient occlusion. And you see that it actually casts ambient occlusion from the geo that we set up to be shadow catchers, and we don't really want that. So we're gonna add some ambient occlusion excluders. So I'm taking a copy of the wall and scaling it and placing that above the corners. And if I go under Lit, Buffer Visualization, and choose Ambient Occlusion, you can actually see how Unreal draws ambient occlusion. So it's wherever two objects intersect, because less light is able to penetrate that area, so it will be darker. So I'm converting this to an ambient occlusion excluder. It's hard to see any updates in the viewport, but you'll see when I'm done doing this. So I'm doing the same procedure with the other wall, taking a copy, scaling it, and placing it above the corner or the intersection between the floor and the wall. And then convert this to an ambient occlusion excluder. Then I'm doing the same for the walls. Just make sure that these overlap and are covering the entire surface. So now if I go back into Preview Live and open Director again and play around with the ambient occlusion strength, you can see that now it's only the ambient occlusion from the box. There's some small areas still on the wall. That's because I need to reposition the plane a little bit. But I'm gonna adjust the ambient occlusion settings, so hopefully that will hide some of it as well. So I'm going back into the ambient occlusion view, and then in the world outliner I select the post-process handler, and under the details panel I search for ambient occlusion, and it gives some options to adjust the radius. So I'm actually going to lower the radius quite a bit, because the default values is usually too high. I won't touch the intensity. It's better to control intensity from Director. So I'm going back to lit mode. Go back into Director again, and now you can see the ambient occlusion is really subtle, but it's important that that is there. It grounds the object much better to the plate. So now again I can use my real box to act as a reference. Now I'm just going to play around with the values of these lights. It's looking how the virtual box looks compared to the real box. So you can see the shadows from the real box is actually very soft and very subtle. They like kind of blend into the wall, and the only way to achieve that in Unreal is to use real-time ray tracing. So I'm gonna enable ray tracing now. I'm gonna save my scene and then go to Edit and Project Settings and search for ray tracing, and it gives you a checkbox. Enable that, and I close this down, and I save my scene again, and then close down Pixeltope because you need to restart. But we also need to enable DirectX 12. So under Setup and General Settings, there is a checkbox for DirectX 12. So I'm checking that, and I'm going back into our level. So now we have our scene open, and right now DirectX is enabled, but you can't really see any difference just yet. But I'm going to go into the post-processors handler again, and under the details panel I'm going to search for ray tracing. And ray tracing doesn't only affect shadows. By default, Unreal also ray traces ambient occlusion, and we don't really want that for this example because it's performance heavy. So I'm disabling the ambient occlusion, and the shadows looks still very hard shadows, and that's because the source radius is set to 0 by default. So by increasing the source radius, you can see that the shadows start to blur. And this is physically correct. This is how shadows behave in real life. Now I'm selecting my spotlights, and I'm actually going to use the convert actor function and convert this into a rectangular light. And these are better when you're using ray tracing, because they give you an option to actually adjust the size of the light source itself. So especially for this example, it is very nice to try to match the lights that I have in the studio. So I'm just scaling those, scaling it down a little bit, making them wider. This is not exact, I'm just eyeballing it. And I'm also scrolling down to the pixel and disable the shadow fall off function. This is something that you need to do when you have ray traced lighting in order to make the shadows appear on the video. So now I'm going back into Director, under Production and Composites. And you want also the use colored shadows to be on when using ray trace shadows. So just dialing in the values, trying different settings. And always looking at the real box as a reference. So you can see the output doesn't really do a good job of showing you the final output. And when it comes to ray trace shadows, it doesn't work that good. So it's better to actually jump in and out from the preview live when you're adjusting lighting and shadows. So I'm slowly just adjusting the position and rotation of the light sources, turning off the snapping, which enables you for fine-tuning. So now we have a fairly close light setup in our scene. And I can still, even if I'm in preview live, I can still select my light sources, and now I'm reducing the source width. So you can see when I lowering the width value, the light source becomes smaller, so my shadows becomes harder. Alright, so I think this is good enough for actually bringing in our final asset. So this box was just there as a placeholder in order to tune the lighting. So I'm gonna delete this box, and I'm gonna add another model. So I'm using the static mesh filter in order to find all my static meshes. So I'm taking this armchair. This is actually from the Pixeltope Studio project. This is modeled in the wrong scale, so I'm scaling it down to be exact. And if I select my camera, I can pinpoint the view, so I can always see what the camera is seeing. And this is nice for aligning objects. And then go back into preview live. So the ambient occlusion doesn't really do much right now. It's but it's still nice to have. So I'm tweaking the shadow setting. You can see the box actually has a reflection. It's very, very subtle, but there is something there, and we want to try to enable that as well. So I'm gonna make a copy of my green screen material. I'm gonna call this green screen reflective, and dragging that onto the floor asset, and double clicking to open the material editor. So the reason for this not being reflective is because the roughness values is very high. So if I'm starting to lower this value, you can see that the reflection in the floor starts to appear. But I don't want to set them too low either, because the real reflection from the box is actually quite rough. It's blurred reflections. So I'm setting this to 0.3. Then I jump back into the preview live to see the final output. And under director, you can also adjust the reflection strength onto the backplate. And you can also see that the wall geometry is being reflected on the floor, and we don't want that. As of now, there is some ray tracing parameters that are only accessible through the command line. So I'm typing r.raytracing.reflections.max_distance, and I'm setting this to 200. So the rays will only go 200 units out from a surface when it looks for reflection. But in order to get those to be rid of them, I still need to select the wall geo and disable the visible in ray tracing. Since the reflections from the real box was very subtle, I want to also the reflections for my chair to be subtle. So the next thing we're going to look at is the light catcher. The light catcher makes it possible for virtual lights to affect the backplate. So I'm dragging in a sphere just to have an object that looks like it's casting light, and I'm creating a new material for this sphere, calling it light sphere, and applying that to the sphere. And in the material editor I connect a parameter into the emissive color slot and also the base color, and setting a blue color. Also by pressing M and clicking in the material editor, it adds a multiply node, and a multiply node will take whatever value you put in and multiply it by any given number. Then I'm saving and compiling the material, and if I now select my multiply node and up the values, becomes the emissive color strength becomes stronger. And then I add a light source, a point light, just drag it into the scene, and placing that inside the sphere. I'm going to turn off cast shadows for this light, since it's inside the sphere. And then scaling down the radius. Go into wireframe mode, just makes it easier to see the lights when it's on the inside. And in the outliner I'm selecting the point light and I'm dragging and dropping it onto the sphere. So now this is a child of the sphere. So if I now move the sphere, the light will follow. But you can see the light is not actually affecting the backplate yet. So in order to fix that, we need to add another plane and position this where we want the light to be applied. So I'm just dragging this and setting it like slightly above the floor, and I'm converting this into a light catcher. And I'm selecting a different light channel for this, because I don't want the other lights that we placed earlier to affect this plane. So I'm only going to set this to be illuminated by channel 2, and by selecting my point light, I select this to cast light on both channel 0 and 1. So there you can see that the light is now illuminating both the virtual object and onto the backplate. if we go back into Director, we can add some bloom to get a nice glow effect on this sphere. And under the color grading panel, we have multiple adjustments for integrating the graphics into the video a bit better. So we have the possibility of adjusting color grading and saturation and white balance at one layer at a time. So for only for the video, or only for the graphics, or for video and graphics combined. So that concludes this AR tutorial. Thank you for watching.